Welcome to Clinical Data Talks, a podcast brought to you by CRS Cube. I'm your host, Sylvain Berthelot. Join me and industry experts as we discuss the latest trends impacting the world of clinical data. So, today, my guest and I share the same passion about increasing patients' involvement in the definition of clinical trials. He dedicated many years in increasing the efficiency of the clinical supply chain, and he recently joined or created even the company One2Treat, where he is the CEO, driving a change in how we analyze the effect of treatments in clinical trials. I'm very pleased to introduce Sebastien Coppe. Hi, Sebastien, how are you doing?
Hello, Sylvain. I'm great. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing great, thank you. So today we're going to talk about something that I know you're very passionate about, which is how to consider clinical endpoints differently, which should lead to more meaningful clinical trial outcomes. And I want to start with the problem, essentially, that you're trying to solve. So how traditional clinical endpoints limiting? How are they limiting how we assess treatment benefits at the moment?
So, as you know, Sylvain, the vast majority of clinical trials that are running today only focuses on one single outcome, so one single, what we call primary endpoint, that will tell whether the clinical trial is a success or not at the end of the clinical trial in a pre-specified way. That's the goal of the primary endpoint. To define whether this drug ultimately deserves to get to market or not. And if you step back right now and you try to ask patients around you, like, does that make sense? Most of the patients may be surprised that you only or mainly rely on one single criteria to tell whether a new treatment deserves to get to market, whether a new treatment is good for them or not. So they will probably tell you that there are a lot of other outcomes, a lot of different facets of their own individual stories that matter to them, that, they would expect a new treatment to help them, or at least, get data access and so on. So I do believe that's where we may help, answer those kind of naive needs from patients. It's more about, we do collect a huge amount of data points in clinical trials. And how can we make sure that the primary endpoint, so again, this kind of pre-specified question that you need to ask before the trial starts, and that at the end of the day, you will analyze the clinical trial success based on this primary endpoint. How do we make sure that the primary endpoint better reflects what matters most to patients?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting topic. As you know, I have a patient advocacy podcast, and that's something that patients who have had a bit of involvement with the clinical industry in general, when they realize that, thinking about Parkinson's, for example, there's only a very limited amount of endpoints that are deemed significant from a clinical point of view. They're quite shocked, actually. And in some ways, it limits it can limit the trials that are started if we focus just on one endpoint. But I'm sure we're going to get to the benefits. So how are you redefining then the way clinical endpoints are designed at One2Treat?
So that's basically the idea of One2Treat founder, Mark Boyce. You may know Mark Boyce because he also founded the companies IDDI, but also CluePoints, based on a slightly different kind of reliable biostatistical technique that opened the door to this kind of era of risk-based quality management. So that's basically what Mark Boyce has been doing for the last 30 years, is having I would say creative ideas from a biostatistical methodological standpoint, and then later on, fund some kind of companies that can also develop some softwares that will facilitate the engagement from the pharma industry leveraging those kind of innovative statistical methodologies. So what he created 15 years ago is this idea of generalized pairwise comparison, so GPC. The idea is to incorporate multiple clinically relevant outcomes within a single assessment. And this single assessment may become the primary endpoint. And what you will try to measure is what we call the net treatment benefit. That's the most important aspect for non-statisticians. I would say to remind out of this podcast is the net treatment benefit is basically the global picture of what you want to assess when you speak about treatment effects. And basically you may ask people, to prioritize the outcomes of interest, like what's the most important outcome of interest for your disease. Imagine if I'm suffering from cancer, maybe overall survival is the most important outcome, but not at any cost. What does it mean? It means that if I have to choose between two treatments and they are more or less similar in terms of expected overall survival, maybe I want to look on a second outcome. That's where comes the second outcome in my list of prioritized outcome. Is if I do not benefit at least by, let's say, 6 months on average, 6 months benefit in overall survival, then I do not care too much about overall survival in my choice choosing between two treatments. Then I will focus on, another criteria that may be my quality of life. And again, imagine that two treatments would offer me similar quality of life. I would focus on the third outcome of interest, that may be some kind of toxicities or grade 3 or grade 4 adverse events or something like this. So again, you may have different clinically relevant patient-focused outcomes that one may need to prioritize, and this prioritized outcome will be the primary endpoint. And at the end of the day, you will assess what we call the net treatment benefit based on those kind of list of prioritized outcomes. So that's a very simple idea that Mark basically suggested to the scientific community 15 years ago. So the first scientific paper, a peer-reviewed paper, was published in 2010. And in the meantime, there have been, probably 60, 70 scientific papers published by a lot of different labs a bit everywhere in the world. And more pharma companies and regulators have been starting to leverage the GPC and net treatment benefit methodology, but still it's a bit slow. So, to give you an idea, there are just a few drugs that have been approved so far by, regulators, FDA, EMA, getting to market, especially in cardiovascular disease. And so that's really the idea of Mark Boyce, is creating Want to Treat company 2 years ago in order to really speed up this, I would say, implementation of the net treatment benefit for all clinical trial designs, or most of them at least, those that are relevant, meaning that one single outcome, one single endpoint is maybe not sufficient to better reflect or correctly reflect what matters to patients. So that's really the idea, is make sure that we package this kind of net treatment benefit approach in easy to be used software solutions, so that we can help pharma sponsors and regulators to run those kind of innovative statistical methodologies in a much more easy way, but also transparent way, because we believe, and that's also the point of Mark Boyce, is we believe that transparency is something that is really important for regulators, for pharma sponsors, but also for patients. And transparency is also part of, understanding why a drug was getting to market, what are the positive effects, what are the of one treatment versus the other. And so all this ability to compare and in a transparent way, we believe it's really, really important. And that's a main outcome from all the softwares from Want to Treat, leveraging this net treatment benefits approach.
Yeah, so you've touched on a lot of different points here that personally I find fascinating. So that's why I was very excited about having this discussion with you. First one, I love the fact that you bring statistics to something very, very useful for clinical trials and for patients. But then you've mentioned patients multiple times, and you've hinted to the fact that patients essentially are in a way involved in the definition of what is beneficial for them. So I love that. So maybe you've already answered that question, but why do you think this new way of defining primary endpoints is more patient-focused from your point of view?
It's for many different indications. Again, one single outcome may not always reflect easily what matters most to patients. So let me take some simple example in rare disease where there have been new treatments that have been commercialized based on a biomarker, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So is a biomarker really something that is understood by patients, that is really bringing them a lot of added value of trust in the new treatment? So you can wonder this. And again, I'm not challenging whether or not those treatments are bringing strong added value to patients. That's not my point. My point is maybe there are different ways to also incorporate multiple outcomes that are more patient-focused, that
Mm-hmm.
may mean something more meaningful to patients, not only to patients, maybe also to clinicians that know what is good or not. I mean, for patients, I mean, think about oncology. I mean, you can ask the feedback from clinicians, from key opinion leaders, from site investigators, for instance, about what would be the most important, the most clinically relevant outcomes for your patient. So again, when we speak about being patient-focused, it's not only just speaking to patients, it's also, I would say, giving more importance to clinicians that are working really closely to patients and asking them to define this kind of multi-dimensional way to describe what is good or not for a patient. We do believe that's the most important way. We feel really, really excited about this opportunity to just engage a lot of people and at the end of the day, define better, more efficient primary endpoint.
Yeah, and you're right. That's something that, like in rare disease, it's very difficult. And often patients know more than clinicians themselves what is significant to them. And symptoms can vary so much between patients as well. It's quite difficult to find one primary endpoint that will have a significance for everyone. So you mentioned like engaging with sites, engaging patients in the definition of what is this composite primary endpoint. But like one step further, how do you define the relevance then of all those criteria that compose the endpoint?
So typically what we would suggest is not being too much creative in defining new outcomes. So what we would do typically is suggest to take multiple outcomes that have been already used in past clinical trials as either primary or secondary or exploratory endpoints, but making sure that you measure them and you incorporate them within this composite primary endpoint. So that's what we typically suggest to our pharma sponsors. Then something really important is if you define this primary endpoint being composed of, let's say, 4 different outcomes, prioritized outcomes, what you will get at the end of the clinical trial is also an individual contribution of each of those 4 outcomes to the net treatment benefit, the total net treatment benefit. So imagine that at the end of the clinical trial, you show that your new treatment is bringing a 20% net treatment benefit. You will also be able, to tell whether this 20% net treatment benefit is mainly coming from the first outcome or the second outcome, or is there one out of the 4 outcomes that is bringing some kind of small detrimental effect to patients. So that's also something positive. You do not always expect new treatments to bring only positive advantages or benefits to patients. You just also want to be aware in a transparent way as a clinician, as a patient, that the quality of my sleep, for instance, may be slightly affected by this new treatment. But compared with another treatment, I will, do not lose my hair. Maybe I do not care. Maybe you do. So again, having this kind of transparent understanding at the end of the clinical trial about what's the individual contribution of each outcome is also something very, very engaging.
Talking about the regulators, so do you yourself engage with regulators directly, or is it something that you ask or recommend that your clients do when they're thinking about implementing such a model?
So we typically try to work in parallel on both streams. So definitely, pharma sponsors will interact with regulators as they do with a more standard single outcome, single endpoint approach. But in parallel, we definitely have a lot of ongoing discussions with regulators, so that they're well aware about this, I would say, more innovative approach. Knowing as well that, for instance, let's take the example about the FDA. There are different divisions, for instance, cardiovascular disease, that are really aware about the methodology and have been using again and again this methodology for many different clinical trial designs. But also, as I was mentioning, for some drugs that are approved right now, that are on the market. One drug, for instance, being tafamidis from Pfizer. Mm-hmm. So this drug has been approved by FDA, EMA, based on a composite approach and generalized pairwise comparison approach. So again, that's just the beginning, and right now that's the goal, is really making it popular not only for a few specific therapeutic areas, but more broadly for all indications or therapeutic areas that may benefit from a multi-facet approach in order to better reflect what matters to patients.
Okay. It's great. It's great to hear that it's already been used and actually approved. I'm going to play devil's advocate here. I'm behind everything you've said. I think it's amazing progress for our industry. However, maybe some of our listeners will think, well, that sounds like a lot of work upfront before you even start your trial. So what benefits do you expect them to gain from applying it to their trial?
So I probably already touched a few of those benefits. For me, the first one is being able to engage with different clinicians. I mentioned site investigators or key opinion leaders within scientific advisory board before defining the protocol of the trial. Long story short, because you leverage more data points, you have more data and more statistical power. What does it mean? It means that the direct consequence is you can expect a significant reduction in sample size. So typically what we see is, for rare disease, we have done it a few times recently, instead of having, 150 patients to be recruited, you may run your clinical trial with the same power, with only 90 or 100 patients instead of 150. So you really reduce your sample size by 40%. And again, 40%, it's not always happening. From time to time it's less, from time to time it's a bit more. But let's say between 20 to 50% sample size reduction. You bring transparent analysis of your treatment effects, not focusing on single primary endpoint and then individual secondary endpoints. That you will always find someone, like you were playing devil's advocate. You will always find someone that will play later on at the end of the trial, the devil advocate. Just pick one single secondary endpoint and just say the results is not that good for that specific. Mm-hmm. So again, that's happening when you just analyze and investigate endpoints one at a time. If you just put them all together, then again, you can discuss, the prioritization of those outcomes. But you can rerun the analysis, and that's again about the transparency game that I was speaking about. That regulators, they love it. That's basically what you will be asked for HTA discussions with, payers, with, to get reimbursement and so on. So that's after R&D, I would say, step, but that's really allowing you to prepare all those discussions by showing again, the totality of the evidence, all the data points, all the outcomes that you have been measuring and collecting. You can change a bit the prioritization and, answer a lot of questions transparently without having to hide things and so on, but more, discuss the prioritization and more the clinical relevance of this kind of list.
How do you expect this methodology to impact the clinical data capture, or at least the type of data that's captured?
So that's a good question. So What we've seen over past clinical trial is from time to time there are secondary endpoints or exploratory endpoints that are captured and tracked, but not always with I would say perfectly from the side. So you may have missing data, you have for some patients and so on. So it's not always easy later on at the end of the clinical trial to analyze, for instance, patient-reported outcomes for such a reason. Just taking an example. Imagine right now that the same patient-reported outcomes is incorporated as part of this list of prioritized outcome. Probably not as the top 1 or 2 outcomes, but maybe outcome number 4 or 5. You may have quality of life scales. You may have patient-reported outcomes. And then all in a sudden it's changing a lot, because then you're putting much more visibility, transparency on those outcomes. So the way you will have to measure, to track, those kind of outcome will be globally the same, but you will put much more, I would say, importance on those. And again, everything related to data management will be much more important because it will be part of the primary endpoint. And you want to make sure you can bring visibility on that. Make sure, even if it's not part, coming back to this example of patient-reported outcomes, even if it's not part of the primary endpoint, coming back to the discussions later on about the payers and discussion with HT and so on, maybe at some point of time you just want to offer to payers the opportunity to define their own list of prioritized outcome. So again, you need those data points to be really, I would say, even in a better way captured, tracked, without having too much missing data and so on. So I do believe it's just a methodology that will put even more importance and strategic visibility or spotlight on the way data management is handled throughout clinical trial.
Yeah, and the point you're making about patient-reported outcomes, like I can see now the impact on not necessarily the data capture, because I imagine that you would still have that as part of your trial, but then you mentioned risk-based quality management. That could then become like your quality of life questionnaire could become one of your areas that you pay more attention to if you know that it will impact your data analysis at the end. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today, except for one last question. What's the best piece of advice you've received that you apply to your daily work?
That's a good one. I would probably say, let's make sure you truly listen to the end user, what we may call in many different industries, truly listen and truly try to understand your end customer. And again, I understand working in clinical trials that customer is not a word that we like to use, and I'm not a big fan of this word, but when you compare what we do in clinical developments with a lot of other industries, the best vendors, the most competitive companies are usually the ones that better listen to and better understand the end user, the end customer needs, right? So we can, from time to time, step back and try to wonder whether we truly listen and truly try to understand what are the needs from the end users. And again, who are the end users? Are there patients? Are there payers? Are there regulators? That's, I do believe, where from time to time we struggle as being part of this development industry, about defining who is the end customer, the end user. Who do we try to convince when we run clinical research? But again, if you believe, and I do believe, that at the end of the day what you want to do is help patients in needs, and I would say that's the goal of everyone working in clinical research. That's really some reason why I love this industry, is because everyone is so much passionate about trying to help patients in needs. But I do believe we can do a better job in, again, defining what does it mean bringing a good treatment or bringing a better treatment to market for those patients. How do we pre-specify it before trial starts? So that's the primary endpoint objective. But also definitely making sure at the end of the day that you bring more transparency about all those individual outcomes. So I do believe the advice I would give is, let's step back and from time to time challenge ourselves. Like, do we truly listen and try to understand what is the most important objective? And there are from time to time some small changes that we're there to try, there to challenge ourselves, challenge a bit our status quo and our comfort zone, and trying to redefine a bit the way we do define what is better treatment, and making sure this definition is not just a definition that will please regulators. I don't think that they are the end users. I don't believe that they are a really important stakeholder that will allow us, to guarantee, I would say, that the end user, the patients in need, they will get exactly what is good for them, meaning that the definition is good. That's the goal of regulators, is approving this definition of what is a better treatment than the other. But let's make sure this definition is also something easily understandable, visual, transparent, simple to be understood by patients.
Yeah. I love that. Very nice. Very nicely said. And interestingly, I fully agree with you. We need to listen to end users. In the case of clinical trials, they are the patients. In my case, the end user may not be directly the patient, but focusing on clinical sites, for example, in a way impacts positively how sites will interact with patients. But yeah, I fully agree with you. Listen to your end users.
And I do believe, when you have a strong purpose, easily explainable and understandable, then everyone is aligned. As I was mentioning, that's the beauty of this industry, right?
Yeah.
Is everyone is really so much passionate about doing something good for patients in need. So again, making sure you can remind the reason why you want, sites, maybe to do things slightly differently, or regulators and so on. I do believe that's this kind of idea about there to challenge, respectfully challenge a bit the status quo, and bring smooth innovation that will truly help, better answer this kind of end user needs, patient needs.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Sebastien. It's been very nice talking to you. I always feel like motivated after a discussion with you, so that's great. Hopefully everyone who's listened to us will do as well. Yeah, thank you for your time.
Great discussion. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sylvain.
And thank you everyone for listening to us, and you will be able to find more clinical data talks on the CRS Cube website.